All right. First, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Brad Parker. He's in New York. Brad's worked with DCIP for a long time and has a lot of expertise in the legal background and context surrounding the Israeli military detention system. So, Brad, could you give us some context about the environment that the Israeli military detention system exists in? Are there other countries that prosecute children in military courts like this?
So the short answer is no, not automatically and systematically like Palestinian children are prosecuted in the Israeli military courts. That is something that is unique amongst the global community. There are some countries where Egypt, Lebanon, where a child, a person under 18, which is the threshold for age of majority under international law. So, a few people under 18 who've been prosecuted in military courts, in different countries. But the thing that is unique about the Israeli military detention system is that all Palestinian children arrested by Israeli forces in the West Bank are prosecuted in the military court. So that is unique. And if you sort of back up, the broader context is that DCI Palestine was created in 1991 specifically to provide legal aid to Palestinian children charged in the Israeli military courts. This isn't something that's new or different. It really is. It has been a part of Israeli military occupation going back to 1967. The military court system as a legal framework is essentially, the regime that dominates Palestinian life kind of throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. So when the Israeli forces entered the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip in 1967, the first thing that happened was they instituted military law. And that military law is still what sort of rules the day for Palestinians, even though you have an Israeli settler presence inside the same territory. It should apply to any person located in occupied territory, but at the end of the day, the reality is two separate laws for two separate populations. So the military court system, right? I think we have this idea, maybe less so these days, that courts bring some form of justice. And I think it's important in the military court system specifically to flag that there is no justice in this system. They're not independent and impartial. You have military officers sitting as the judges, either active duty or reserve duty officers, right? So the arresting forces, the prosecuting forces, and then the judiciary are all the same entity. So it's the furthest you could get from sort of any type of justice. And then the other thing I'd say just on the contextual piece is that, from what we see, it really, guilt or innocence, like these things are irrelevant in the military court system. Palestinian children are detained, prosecuted, whether there's alleged wrongdoing or not. What it really comes down to is, where they live. Children that live near settlements, near military bases, military infrastructure, sort of the tangible physical things that are occupation, right? Those are the children that end up being detained, prosecuted in this military court system. So it really is completely, regardless of guilt or innocence, if you're in this system.
Thanks, Brad. We heard from the boys in the film that, they experienced many different kinds of ill treatment at the hands of Israeli soldiers. Are Israeli forces ever held accountable for mistreating Palestinian children like that?
I mean, the short answer is no. Widespread ill treatment torture, it's the norm. Basic due process violations, fair trial rights that are denied. There's really no accountability. I think over the years, there's been growing calls and demands for accountability, and that's put pressure on Israeli authorities to, in some ways, dress up their own response and to react to it. But at the end of the day, it's never resulted in, actual steps to end ill treatment or the due process violations. And I think that is a broader trend in all things related to human rights violations against Palestinians, including all the other issues that DCI Palestine documents. In the context that we work, systemic impunity is the norm, and there's virtually no accountability for any violations of Palestinian human rights, and that's why it's incredibly important to have all you here and to have tools like this to keep exposing the reality of Palestinian children's experience in this system and more broadly living under Israeli control, because ultimately it really is going to take pressure from all of you and all of us working together to force the change that's so necessary.
Thanks, Brad. We're going to move. I have a couple questions for Manar. She is DCIP's International Advocacy Officer in Ramallah, and she works very closely with our documentation team that works to document cases where children are having their rights violated. She was also instrumental in the creation of this film and helped select which boys to feature and helped work with them alongside DCIP lawyers. So Manar, could you share a little bit about DCIP's documentation process and what it was like to help make this film?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Miranda, and thanks everyone for being here today. So as Brad and Shana mentioned earlier, we were founded 30 years ago as a legal aid group, but then we expanded our work to start document the violations that these Palestinian children face on daily basis. And this includes violations from Israeli settlers, detention, like different types of violations, children who are whose houses are vulnerable to being, for example, demolished by Israeli authorities. And then we started exposing these violations through our advocacy unit. So it's our work, like these three units, their work is kind of complementary. And when it comes to the documentation of detention, first of all, we have our sessions that are called Know Your Rights. And as Brad mentioned, children who are in friction zones, who are more exposed to being detained, are living in, for example, refugee camps that are near Israeli settlements or next to military bases. We usually go and give them sessions about their rights if they ever get detained. It's not only for these children, but also for their families, for their parents. So this is one kind of, letting people know about our work. And our documentation team, whenever they are always on the field, following up on media outlets, for example, receiving information from the society, and whenever they receive information about a child who is detained, they reach out to our lawyer. So this is also another, way for people to know about our services, the legal aid services. So this is when it comes to our documentation. And for this film, reaching out. When we started doing this film, I was really getting involved in the DCIP's work. And this was the moment I've learned a lot about the situation these children go through. It doesn't matter how much they tell you until you really read the affidavits from these children and what they go through. And until you reach out to them and talk to them. So reaching out to these children wasn't really difficult for us as DCIP because usually our lawyers follow up on the cases of the children since the moment of their arrest. So they give them legal consultation prior to the interrogation, and this usually happens through the phone. So our lawyers have to put extra effort in order to make these children comfortable and talk to them. And they follow up with them in each step until they receive the sentence or they are released. So through this process, usually lawyers build the trust between the DCIP's work and the children and their families, and they get to know these children more. So for picking and choosing these children, we go basically to our database and read the affidavits and then talk to our lawyers, and they, tell us, because they know them pretty well, tell us which children feel more comfortable sharing their experiences in front of the camera and telling people what they have been through. So basically, this is how it went. And during the filming of this video, our field worker was accompanying the videographer, and he also puts effort in order to, make these children comfortable.
Yeah, thank you, Manar. I think, you and the lawyers and the field workers did such an excellent job choosing just the right boys to feature in this film. A lot of people shared comments in the chat that, the boys spoke with such dignity and told their stories so clearly that they were, they really did an excellent job. So thank you to you and the team and everybody who worked with supporting those boys to tell their story. So we're going to turn to Zaina Ashrawi Hutchison, who is joining the call. She is a really excellent activist and advocate for Palestinian human rights in Virginia. So has a lot of experience in advocacy work and congressional type of work, advocating for Palestinian human rights in the United States. So Zaina, as an activist in the US, how do you think this film and these boys' experiences can help advocates like us working for Palestinian human rights? How would you use this film in your advocacy, for example?
Thank you, Miranda. Thank you, Manar, for all your hard work, and to all the DCIP members on the ground and to DCIP all over for working so hard for Palestinian children and their rights. And to everybody here, thank you for joining. Your presence here is not only important for DCIP's work, but for Palestinians and children in particular who see that the world is listening to them. I'm gonna choose to go about the answer in a slightly longer way, Miranda, if I may. Because as you know, Israel's oppression of Palestinians takes on many forms. It's systemic in courts and policy, both locally in Palestine and all over the world. It's physical through murder, torture, and imprisonment. It's tangible, obviously, through the theft of land and house demolition. And it's a calculated erasure through theft of culture, denial of our history and experiences, and silencing our narratives. Every Palestinian has a personal story that is a result of Israeli oppression. We are all subjects of an agenda of dehumanization, witnesses to a silenced reality, and with our mere existence, we are a proud, powerful, and unstoppable resistance. When asked about my advocacy and why I devote my time to activism, I talk about my childhood and my own experiences as a Palestinian born and raised in Palestine, who was exiled by Israel and now living in the United States. A privileged Palestinian, who has never been imprisoned, and here I am, safe, talking to you all. But one of the main reasons I became an advocate and an activist is when I realized, and in realizing that I carry with me an amana, an invaluable treasure in the form of stories and narratives of those back home who aren't and weren't as privileged. That's what drives me. While most people talk about Palestine and the Palestinian narrative purely from a political angle, it is important to remember that it is a civil rights issue, an environmental rights issue, a feminist issue, a human rights issue, and importantly, for the purposes of our gathering here today, a children's rights issue. Palestinians aren't mere news bulletins for fear and warmongers to further their military domination agendas. Some of the most frustrating aspects in my work as a rights advocate is the demonizing propaganda that's out there, but also the lack of exposure or knowledge about the reality of the Palestinian struggle to the average person, often to no fault of their own, obviously. Yes, changing the narrative and the dialogue in our respective countries, and I know there are many from all over the world here, does partly happen through participating in protests and signing petitions. However, lasting and intrinsic change happens through three main parts, in my opinion, as an advocate and activist, Miranda. Through education, engagement, and persistence. And that can take many forms, obviously. But for the sake of this conversation, let's take this film, for example, and everybody here. Your presence here and having watched this film isn't just merely a cosmetic event. You are here voluntarily to learn. You have the ability to carry this narrative and the narratives, those of Osama and Islam and Qusay. But those aren't narratives of only three voices. They represent a lot more. They are reflective, as Manar and Brad and Shayna had said, reflective of what many Palestinian children go through. But now you have the knowledge, you have the narrative. And once this video is released publicly, as Jennifer put in the chat, you will have the tools you will need to engage. If you are an organization, host a screening for your membership. Reach out to DCIP for assistance and they will help in any way. The team may even possibly provide support or a speaker or other ways to help. If you are an individual, host a screening for your friends and family, or if that's too difficult, share it with your friends and family. Send it to your local congressional representatives, or better yet, hold a meeting with them and show it there. Other ways to engage is share this video on social media, or even share about this video on social media, about what you've learned. And you're welcome to use the hashtag #NoWayToTreatAChild. I think, Miranda, if you don't mind, we can put it in the chat at some point. But use that hashtag, let people follow the stories, the Palestinian children's stories. And lastly, and this is probably the most important of any advocacy you can do for Palestinian rights or any other rights, persistence. Once matters, yes, true. But the more you educate, engage, or both, the bigger the impact and the louder our collective voice. Remember, part of the agenda of oppression, Israeli oppression, is silencing and erasure. Elected officials and politicians want you to think that Palestinian children detained by Israeli military is a complicated and difficult issue. But in reality, it's basic humanity. We have heard from Manar and Brad and Shayna and Miranda and from the children themselves how the documentation and how they went about getting those stories from the children. It took a lot of trust, it took a lot of work. And they entrusted all of us with this amana, their invaluable personal narratives for us to share. So now is the time that I, personally as a Palestinian, but also as an activist and an advocate, I am asking you all to be advocates. It's not hard. Your voice is needed. And I ask you and implore you to honor that amana that we heard and carry their voices forward. Thank you so much, Miranda. And again, thank you so much, DCIP, for this very powerful video.
Thank you so much, Zaina. I feel like I get chills every time I hear you speak at an event like this, but this was particularly powerful. Thank you so much for sharing about your experience doing this work. And yeah, it's very inspiring to all of us. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you also to Manar and Brad for sharing your expertise working with DCIP and with these children and on these issues for so long. Like Zaina says, it really does take persistence. It's very long work, everybody. We have a few minutes for some questions. We're running a little bit close to the hour here, so we'll only probably have time to answer a few questions. But if you have any questions for Zaina, Brad, or Manar about the Israeli military detention system or the experiences of these children or anything along those lines, please put it in the chat and we will see if we can answer a few of them. If you asked a question in the chat earlier, I'm going to ask you to put it in the chat again because we've had a lot of people chatting, so we don't want to lose any good questions. All right, while we wait for a few questions to come in, I wanted to let you all know that the film and a discussion guide will be online on the No Way to Treat a Child website after this event. I will send you the link in an email on Monday or Tuesday. We encourage all of you to host your own screenings with your group or in your community. And if you would like support doing that, or if you just want to tell us that you're doing it, we'd love to know when people are doing screenings. You can send us an email at info@nowaytotreatachild.org. But we'll send you all of that information in email in a few days, so don't worry. The film will be available on YouTube, so there won't be anything special you need to do to find it. All right. Brad, we have a few people asking about the experience of Palestinian girls. So the 3 children we heard about in this film were all boys, and folks are wondering if girls are ever detained or targeted in the same way that boys are.
Yeah, it's a good question. We should have sort of mentioned it in the context. The majority, I mean, nearly all of the Palestinian children that are detained by Israeli forces are adolescent boys. So here we're talking, anywhere from 12 years old to 17 years old. Under Israeli military law, the age of criminal responsibility is 12 years old. This is the same as Israeli civilian law. So technically and legally, the military courts don't have jurisdiction over any person under 12 years old. So that's sort of the context there. When it comes to girls, what we see is there'll be, really a small number, maybe 1 in detention any given month through the year. Sometimes, when detention figures are higher, sort of more broadly, that could be up to 6 girls in detention, up to 12. But what we see as the systematic sort of targeting of Palestinian children for arrest is almost 100% Palestinian boys. And again, right, not a justice system really as a tool of control, right? Arresting teenage boys from their homes in the middle of the nights where their families can't protect them. It functions as a control mechanism, and boys are targeted to carry out that endeavor. where, right, if you arrested the same number of girls, it might be a different reaction from folks. So that's sort of what the reality is.
Okay, thanks, Brad. We had another question, I think it will be for you, about sentence length. And what do you know about the different ways that a child's sentence is determined? So the film featured kids who were detained for really varying amounts of time. One child was, I think, 7 days, and the other was almost 2 years. So how are those thought about?
Yeah, so the first thing to say, I guess, is that almost all children plead guilt, and their detention ends in a plea bargain, a plea agreement. So it's rare that there's actually a trial in the military court. You're arrested, and there's no independent oversight over arrest, right? There's no evidence being collected on a specific incident that's being presented to an independent judge or official that then issues a warrant, and then the warrant goes and, you know, Israeli forces act on it, right? The overwhelming majority of children are arrested based on suspicion. So Israeli forces can essentially arrest any person that they think has violated the Israeli military law. The overwhelming majority of kids are charged with throwing stones, which is a specific offense under the military law. So there's really no evidence against children except the soldiers' suspicion. So this is why you see in interrogations, right, children without access to counsel. We see a lot of coerced statements, documents drafted in Hebrew that children are forced to sign. So all of this sort of plays into that, right? So children that are younger get lesser sentences, right? Or in their plea agreements. Children that are older tend to get longer sentences. From there, it sort of depends on what the charges are against you, right? If you have one stone throwing charge and you're 15 years old, you know, we know that we can probably get that child out of prison, which is in the interest, you know, the best interest of that child, right? That's the goal, to remove them from that custodial detention setting. You know, they might serve 2 months or 3 months for that particular charge. You know, if it's 3 stone throwing charges, throwing a Molotov cocktail, something else, the scope of what a plea agreement would be and then what the sentence is sort of adjusts there as well. So there's, you know, we have a lot more information on this particular question if people are interested, because it's sort of complex and also interesting in the way that, right, if you're a 15-year-old, you'll get a suspended sentence in addition to a fine, in addition to the time served, that, you know, once, even when you're released, if you're arrested and charged with, you know, throwing stones, you automatically have to serve that suspended sentence. And there's all these sort of interesting and sort of devastating components to the sentencing, which you can find on our No Way to Treat a Child website and some of the reports that we have there. But that's the quick answer.
Thanks, Brad.